So I'm Dr. Ajinkya Deshpande. I work for the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology in Edinburgh, Scotland, and with UKCEH and University of Peradeniya, with a very, very strong support from Dilmah Conservation, we've been able to establish a very complicated experiment in a very complex site up in the Rilagala forest in the central highlands of Sri Lanka. So along with measuring the lichens that Buddhika and Dr. Gautami will be talking about after me, we also measure more environmental parameters and the concentrations of ammonia in the atmosphere in these forests, so that when we have our lichen data and we see how the lichens have been changing, we can relate it back to the environmental data and see how the lichens respond. So I'll be talking a little bit on the data side today, on the technical side of things, and I'll be highlighting why this high quality, high frequency data is required for the kind of research that we do. What are the existing measurement gaps in South Asia and Sri Lanka, and how our experiments plugs a massive gap in this region. I'll take you through the South Asian Nitrogen Hub experiment up in the Rilagala Mountains, the ones that Professor Nisanka and Mark have just mentioned. And then I'll show some brief highlights of the data that we have collected so far and what it means, how it's going to be useful for the overall region. And then lastly, I will very briefly talk about a future project that we are planning. We still haven't received the funding for it, but if we get it, we will be expanding our work in Sri Lanka. So stay tuned for that last part. What is the need for collecting this high quality, high frequency data, and in low frequency data work? So as you can see, South Asia is a region with a rapidly changing climate, especially hydroclimate, which means precipitation patterns. As you all have experienced in the last few years in Sri Lanka, quite a lot of floods as well as droughts. So one year you have an extreme drought and the next year you have an extreme flood. So it's becoming very hard to predict what the climate is doing. At the same time, in this entire South Asian region, starting all the way from Pakistan, India, into Bangladesh, Nepal, and then down into Sri Lanka and Maldives, degrading air quality is becoming a massive problem. There's a continuous increase in pollutant emissions, as Professor Nisanka showed earlier, and the future the predictions show that these emissions are not going to slow down, at least for the next few decades. So there is a combined effect of a changing climate, warming, less rain, or extremely heavy rain, along with air pollution. And these two combined have a massively negative impact on sensitive organisms like lichens or mosses. We'll see some of those impacts today. And that can then result in a widespread loss of these species, which would be extremely harmful for a biodiversity hotspot like Sri Lanka. So all of this put together increases the critical need for high quality measurements in this region so that we can start seeing what the impacts are and how can we mitigate them. So what is the urgent need for measuring meteorological measurements, especially in forests? So when you look at response from organisms, you need a very high frequency data set. For example, if you have a monthly average of air temperature, it's not going to tell you much about how your organisms are responding to it. So what you need is a data at a diurnal, hourly, or a minute scale so that you can track how your environment is changing at that high frequency scale. It is extremely important to maintain the quality of that data. So you cannot be reporting numbers that are incorrect or highly uncertain. And the most important part is maintaining the continuity of this data. So providing a long-term time series is extremely important. So if you measure some parameters over one season, a few months, that don't mean much because there's quite a lot of temporal fluctuation. So you have to provide a long-term time series. And the kind of site that we are working in is extremely, the environment is not very conducive to setting up these sensors. So we have to put in a lot of effort with the help of Dilmah to maintain that the sensors are working and providing correct data. This is one of the first data sets from this region that provides micrometeorology within the canopy. So meteorology is the overall climate over a landscape, But micrometeorology is when you focus deep inside a forest and see what happens within that forest canopy, how the temperatures fluctuate within the canopy, how humidity fluctuates, because that is important to when you study your organism response. Same for heat and humidity dynamics within the forest. And it's also important to understand the role of air turbulence, so how the air circulates within the forest, so that we can then predict if a pollutant like ammonia enters the forest, how does it get transported and where does it deposit, where does it end up within the forest canopy. There's a massive gap in meteorological measurements across the entire South Asian region, and most countries pretty much rely on satellite measurements, which have quite high uncertainty. So we don't have too many surface measurements. Only 2 countries in South Asia monitor droughts on a monthly scale. At least only 2 countries that make this data public, but the rest of the data, if it is measured, it's not declared outside for public use. The measurement frequency is too low, as I said, monthly data, which does not mean much. The data is made available retrospectively. So for example, the data today will be made public 2 years later, which does not mean much. And we don't have any real-time availability of data. Most of the high-quality, high-frequency measurements were done 15, 20 years ago. So the data is old, and we don't know what the current situation is. And then, as you might have faced this issue in your own research, that getting data from government sources is very, very difficult. So just going through the government website and getting access to that data is a very complicated process. So we're hoping we can simplify that. And for students and researchers, having that data available that you can use for your research is not available right now. So we're trying to focus on making it available now. And similarly with air pollution monitoring, the situation is even worse. South Asia, as Professor Nisanka showed, is a massive hotspot for nitrogen pollution, lots of emissions, especially ammonia. And without the availability of surface measurements, we don't really know what pollutants are there in the atmosphere and at what quantities. There's also an over-reliance on satellite measurements and model data, which again is extremely highly uncertain. And we don't really know what the actual concentrations are like on ground, what air we are breathing right now. We don't really know what the concentrations are like. Only one South Asian country has a monitoring network, that is India. However, their entire network is focused entirely in cities and urban areas, and there are no measurements in natural areas or forests, which we are trying. So in terms of biodiversity response, we don't really have actual measurements on ground. So the title of this slide is Why Focus on Sri Lanka? It's not showing up, but that's fine. So as you all know, Sri Lanka is a massive biodiversity hotspot. If you look at the global map of biodiversity hotspots, Sri Lanka flashes there, and because there's such a high level of endemism and high species richness. However, it is also ecologically extremely vulnerable because you get so many droughts and floods and extremely high temperatures, which puts the overall ecology of the region at high risk. There are lots of tropical forests that are prone to fragmentation. So if you go into the central highlands, you see that all the forests are pretty much surrounded by tea plantations, and all these patches are not connected to each other. Proximity to India is a bit of a problem as well, because in Sri Lanka we get long-range transport of pollutants coming over from India. And so that's a bit of a transboundary issue. The economics and politics of the country have been changing quite fast, and with that, the environmental and agricultural policy has also been changing quite fast. So that puts a massive impact on biodiversity. But we have seen in the last 3 years since we've been working here that there's a massive potential for public involvement. Students, researchers have been extremely interested in what we do, and we've been getting more and more involvement. So that makes Sri Lanka the ideal country to conduct this experiment in. So that's fine. Some of my text is not showing up, but I will there. So these photos are from the Rilagala experiment that you've so far heard about. We have set up a 12-meter meteorological tower, which extends about 5 meters above the forest canopy. And we have set up climate sensors all throughout, all the way starting from the ground level up to 5 meters above the forest canopy. And we also measure concentrations, background ammonia concentrations in the air at high and low frequency. And we have set up a small ammonia enhancement experiment, which basically replicates a small point source of ammonia. And we increase ammonia concentrations in a very controlled area so that we can then study the response of lichens and how there is slightly higher concentrations than what we see usually. So that's the whole experiment, a meteorological tower and a small ammonia enhancement experiment, along with ammonia monitoring spread across the forest. So we can see the concentrations in different parts. So that's basically how it looks like. The tower which extends slightly above the canopy so that we can see what happens within the forest and what happens above the forest. We measure temperature, humidity, wind speed, rainfall at different levels within the canopy. And we have a wind sensor that controls ammonia enhancement. Ammonia is enhanced only when the wind conditions are conducive to the enhancement. And to measure ammonia, we have set up something called passive ammonia samplers. We also call them alpha samplers. It's a very simple design. In that white plot, the white pot that you see under the saucer is a small filter paper that is coated in citric acid, because citric acid works as an absorbent for ammonia. These are and extremely easy to deploy. So a person goes out there, mostly Buddhika, and he sets them out, and then you don't have to worry about them for a month. All you do is you go out the next month, take them back, and put new samplers in. The filter paper is protected by a membrane, which protects the membrane from getting wet, and then the filter paper can be brought in the lab and analyzed for ammonium concentrations, which then gives you ammonia concentration in the air. So meteorological data, the title of this slide is Decoding Meteorological Data and what it means. So just as an example, I have shown a whole time series of air temperature measured at 2 meters from the ground inside the forest. Starting from March of 2022 up until now, you can see that we have a very high frequency data set that we've been able to maintain. So we've been, so far, we've got a data stream of 56 different meteorological parameters within the forest with about 4 million data points so far. You can imagine the amount of processing that goes into building this data set. So Buddhika and myself, we take care of maintaining this data. As you can see, we've been able to maintain a good coverage of data collection because it's a very harsh environment. So the sensors go bad, the data logging system. We lose power supply sometimes. So it's not very easy to maintain 100% data coverage. So we had 86% data coverage in 2022. And then we had problems in 2023, so we went down to about 60%. But now, much better now. In 2024, we've got 96% of data coverage so far. So this high-frequency data helps us understand diurnal variation, what happens during the day, what happens during the night, and how that changes seasonally. So what will happen to pollutant deposition on such fine scales? It also helps us identify climate anomalies. Is there a drought coming? Is there a flood coming? So if we see some massive spikes or troughs in the data, that tells us something about if there's a meteorological anomaly going on or not. And this remains the first ever multi-year high-frequency climate data set ever produced from Sri Lanka. So that has been one of our massive achievements. And this is just to show the kind of fluctuation that you get in meteorological parameters above and below the forest canopy. You can see temperatures vary by about 1.5. Relative humidity varies by about 5 to 6%. And wind speed varies massively about. So all of this data then put together and the ammonia concentrations that we get, we then combine it to see how the ammonia moves and where it deposits, how much it deposits during different seasons in a given year. It also tells us what the trees do. For example, rainfall. About 40% of the rainfall never reaches the forest floor. Only 60% of it reaches the forest floor. So if you are interested in studying soil microbiology or soil emissions or litter decomposition, then you would need this kind of data. You would need to know how much water is reaching the forest floor. Similarly, if you are studying ground vegetation or lichens or bryophytes, you would need to know how much radiation they're getting. So on an average, 73% of the radiation gets blocked by the canopy, and only about 27% penetrates the canopy floor. These are some of the ambient ammonia concentrations that we have measured so far. The red line that you see is called a critical level. So a critical level means that above these concentrations, your lichens will start to show negative effects. And as you can see, for quite a lot of months, this is monthly data, these levels have started to go above the critical level now. So that's a very useful chart to show, let's say, to a policymaker so that they can see that we are threatened almost on the borderline now. And using the enhancement experiment, we were also able to understand where this ammonia ends up. So you have an ammonia in the air. Not all of that ammonia will deposit on surfaces like the soil surface or leaves or wood. So using a model which takes the data from the meteorological tower, we were able to assess where this ammonia ends up. So as you can see, about 1/3 of the ammonia ends up into the soil, and 1/3 of the ammonia ends up on the tree leaves in the cuticles. So these are some of the first ever ammonia deposition measurements made from tropical forests, not just the South Asian region, but across the world. So some of the large-scale implications include that this study provides some of the very first physical and biological measures of this kind from the Sri Lankan tropical forests. Now, because this work has not been done before, this establishes a baseline for future. So let's say another study is done 20, 30, 40 years from now. These data will be used as a baseline, although the baseline should have been established many years ago. It gives us insights on diurnal and seasonal patterns, which we did not have before. It gives us critical information on the vertical dynamics of both air pollution and meteorology within the forest. It also tells us that ammonia concentrations have reached levels that can now start to threaten biodiversity, and that has been a very a massive highlight of this study. As I said earlier, South Asia does not have many measurements. So geographically, this study plugs a massive geographical gap. So beyond South India, there are no measurements. So now we have this one critical spatial point that will plug this spatial gap. Also, and very importantly, we are extremely focused on making all of this data available online for free for students and researchers. So if you scan this QR code, it will take you to the 2022 data set. It's all clean. It has all the documentation. It tells you how the data was measured. So if you want to use this data for your research or for writing a paper, you can use it. We are in the process of getting the 2023 data uploaded right now. So in the next few weeks, the 2023 data will become available on that same link. So feel free to take a picture and save that link with you. If you want some data that's still not available, you can contact any of us, and we will be very happy to provide the data to you, because open availability is our extreme priority. So very briefly, I want to talk about a future project that we are planning. We still don't have the funding for it, and we don't know if we are going to get the funding for it. But if we do, we'll be working in Sri Lanka for 3 more years. So this project basically needs involvement from the Sri Lankan people in 2 aspects. The first part is we are setting up a working group of policymakers, practitioners, NGOs, and the South Asian Cooperative Environment Program to understand what the policymakers need to put ammonia into national and international policies. So we'll be forming a group that you can be a part of if you are in a position to do that, and help us understand from your perspective what is needed, what questions do policymakers need answered, and then we'll see if we can help you. And then in another work package, we need involvement from Sri Lankan students and researchers. Right now, you can see we have one site where we are measuring lichens in Rilagala. We want to expand that to 100 sites across Sri Lanka, but we cannot do that alone. So we'll need students from other universities and researchers to help us with that. So if you are interested in, and there's a lot of learning opportunity as well because we'll be conducting in Sri Lanka. So if you are interested, my email is on the next slide. Feel free to take a photo and send me an email, or come and talk to any of us after this presentation, and we'll get in touch with you. Thank you so much.